there's been a lot of what they call LLM jacking going around recently. So there were some really good reports that have come out in the last year. If you look up LLM jacking, you'll find them, where this is just basically another type of resource theft. If a resource exists and it's useful to people, somebody will want to steal that compute power from you. And in this case, if they have the token, so like your authentication token for a model, and access to that API model, the URL that it's living at, which will be where it was deployed to when you created the resource, how you interact with it, then an attacker can basically slap this into a large infrastructure they have that creates a backend pool of AI resources that they can send queries to. So maybe
learning about Azure security, especially incident response in Azure, is something that you're interested in. This is the episode for you. I had Katie Knowles from Datadog. She's a security researcher in the Azure space, and she used to be an incident response person for Azure, so I thought she's probably the best person to talk about incident response in Azure. Considering that's not a topic that is spoken about enough, I thought this would be the perfect topic for all of us to get an understanding of what it's like to have an incident, respond to an incident in Azure. What are some of the things that probably should be taken care of? What are some of the fundamentals that you can overlap between Azure and what you probably already know from AWS or from on-premise world? So overall, I think it's a great conversation. If you know someone who's trying to transition into the world where maybe like me, you have just recently being part of a merger and acquisition where the new company is working in the Azure land and you're trying to figure out how do I do incident response here? What are some of the things that I need to know from a security perspective? This is definitely a great conversation for someone like that. So if you know someone who probably is looking into this, definitely share this episode with them. And as always, if you are listening or watching the episode of Cloud Security Podcast for a second or third time, I would really appreciate if you can support us by hitting the follow, subscribe button on the audio platforms like Apple or Spotify, or if you're watching some videos, YouTube and LinkedIn, please consider subscribing. That definitely helps more people know about us as well. Thank you so much for supporting us. And by the way, if you're attending Disobey, which is a security conference in the Nordics, I would be there with Cloud Security Podcast. Definitely come and say hello. But if you are not, that's okay as well. I'll still bring insights for what it is to be working in cloud security in the European region. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. I'll talk to you soon. Hello, welcome to another episode of Cloud Security Podcast. Today I have Katie Knowles. Thanks for coming in, Katie.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I am excited to have you as well because I haven't spoken about Azure for at least for what feels like a while. So today's conversation is very important from that perspective for me personally. But before we get into it, could you share a bit about yourself and your professional journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a little bit of everything, but I like it that way. I started out studying electrical engineering, realized that wasn't the most exciting career path for how many different things I like to study, all the different topics I love to get into. So I ended up in security, thankfully. From there, I've been a security engineer, network and web app pen tester. Then I went over and did some incident response, which brought me to cloud, along with threat hunting and detection engineering. And now I'm a security researcher at Datadog.
And incident response is what I would double click on today, and this, at least in this conversation, with many more to come on some of the other topics you touched on as well. Maybe just to give a lay of the land, because I think the way I've seen myself, I've come from that on-premise background, did AWS first, did a bit of Azure and GCP, but I've not done a lot of incident response. But I guess even to lay a foundation for people who are probably coming from that on-premise world, how different is when I was studying for OffSec or OSCP, whatever that is, that certification still there? I don't know if it's still there, OSCP, but at least it used to be the cool thing was to get a domain admin in the Windows area. And okay, if you're a domain admin in a Windows domain, like you're like God level. What is that in Azure land? What's kind of like the lay of the land people care about in the Azure land when it comes to an incident?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the lay of the land from a domain admin perspective because it's still relevant. OSCP, I think, is still relevant too, but the domain admin part, especially, there's a lot of attacks that can be used from on-prem, especially for the Active Directory Microsoft side to get to Azure. And there are equivalents as well. So pretty similarly to on-premises, if you have global admin, you'll have access to all of the Azure resources. You have a way to escalate into Azure permissions from your Azure Active Directory or Entra ID permissions. I might use both terms interchangeably. Entra is the new word, Azure AD is the old word, but people still say it. And it also has that relation where both are the core identity product. So there's a lot of cross between the two, a lot of what they call hybrid environments or hybrid deployments. If I'm a big enterprise, I might have had Active Directory for 10, 20 years. Now I'm moving into Azure. There's ways to go back and forth between those two so that if I get permissions in either of those spaces that are significant, it could be that I can move to on-premises hosts or from on-premises hosts into the cloud and compromise cloud resources as well. So the blast radius with Azure is a lot more I don't want to seem too grandiose here, but it's a little bit more significant than maybe AWS or even Google in some environments.
Or because AWS and Google have their own identity thing that they're looking after, whereas Active Directory may be a single sign-on or a SAML connection or whatever to the ADFS that maybe is the relationship similar to, at least from what I remember, it used to be around group policies for, hey, Ashish has certain group policies, or he or she gets access to Azure and certain services within Azure. But then you're saying the global admin and the role admin as a it's not just my on-premise, but also my Azure. One can translate back into my local on-premise permissions as well. There's
Yeah,
a two-way relationship.
there's going to be a lot of really complicated ways to do this. So let's maybe think about we have an environment where let's say that we have Active Directory for on-premises and we manage our devices using Intune.
Yeah.
Now, an attacker comes in and gets access to our Azure environment, is able to escalate permissions in some way. They might be able to manage those Intune devices and use a script to pop back onto the hosts and then start compromising the domain. Again, very generalized, but there's a lot of scenarios like that for both directions.
Yeah.
And then a lot of permissions within different applications, just like on premises, right? When we talk about Active Directory hacking, these days it's getting into certificate services and Exchange and all kinds of crazy backdoors and DLLs. Not obviously the DLLs don't apply in Azure, but there's similarly lots of different services. If I'm an Exchange administrator, what can I do with that? If I have application permissions to read a user's mail, what can I do with that? And I won't get too deep into that yet, but the types of permissions available are a little bit different than what's on premise as well.
Oh, wow. And the funny thing is, Katie, I was thinking what happens in AWS land, S3 bucket over to the internet. You might say, what blob storage is my is my domain admin. Didn't realize there was a lot more depth to all this Azure land. But are those things still relevant? I guess maybe is the whole, and maybe to generalize the whole cloud security space a bit, a lot of the conversation always comes down to, hey, you have an misconfigured resource accessible to the internet. That probably after identity, that's like the number two reason for why cloud security incidents happen in most scenarios. Is that still relevant for Azure? Or because it sounds like identity is already quite complex before we even jump onto local identity and all of that. So is that still things that happen, or is that a common news in Azure world?
Yeah, public exposure is still a huge issue. I'd say that the context of what's exposed matters a lot. So if I've got a virtual machine that's exposed to the internet and I've just been testing with it, which can happen quite a lot with Azure, there's a lot of MSDN, so developer network, it used to be called, now it's like a Visual Studio subscription. And Microsoft loves setting up a business to hand these out like candy in their main Azure tenant. And there's nothing wrong with a little experimentation, but if you get a certain number of users who've created demo environments, maybe the demo environment's got some sensitive data, or they have just left it exposed and now even their free credits, still not the greatest to get those crypto mined out on the company dime in some way. So a lot of that will happen, and the context of what's exposed will be very important. If they're
Right.
using the demo environment with sensitive credentials or a user session tied to their Azure account, like they log into the Azure CLI on that VM, then that token could be used to pretty much access anything within Azure land. You can use those tokens to exchange for a lot of different applications. It's called the FOCI, Family of Client Identities. Really good reading if anyone's curious about it. Just basically, if I've got a token for Azure, I can probably use that with Exchange or with Azure RBAC versus, so the Azure resources versus Entra ID. Those are
Yeah.
going to take different tokens, but I can exchange them back and forth. So I've got lots of interconnectivity I can work with.
Interesting. And maybe just to double click on the identity a bit more as well, because obviously we mentioned Active Directory, Entra ID as well, and a lot of enterprise obviously have been using, or even a lot of companies have used Active Directory for a long time. That's where a lot of us started our careers, for lack of a better word. If you are in a tech company back in the day, you definitely have heard of Active Directory, either for right reasons or wrong reasons. But with Entra ID, what's the identity interaction between resources? And I guess, is there more? I know there's a whole, I guess, local users in AWS and local, there's something called AWS IAM users, which is like, oh, it's not just your Active Directory users, you have local users in Azure. What does the identity landscape look like in Azure world? Obviously, you can't touch on the whole Active Directory users, which are your corporate users, but are there any specific in Azure as well, which may be relevant from an incident response perspective? Because I imagine that's still number one in terms of reasons for why there's an incident in the first place?
Yeah, so there's going to be the user identities, I guess, that we've been talking about. There's also going to be service identities. So what would have been a service account in on premises, it's going to be a service principal, and those can cover a lot of different things. They're going to be paired with an application registration that can allow, this is one of those cloud things, right? Now we're getting sassy
Yeah.
in terms of interconnectivity. Maybe Adobe needs access to my environment to provide their super legit PDF services. Now they have an application registration that they can add a credential to and use that app reg to authenticate to our environment. The local service principal in our environment will perform actions for them, but basically they've got a backdoor with some kind of permissions that we've given to that account. So that can be really scary and very complicated, the ways that those are built out. Or managed identities can be associated to virtual machines. They're another type of service principal.
Right.
And something that can be tricky from the research side that I deal with a lot these days is that Microsoft will try to obfuscate the complexity of these different identities. So they'll say, oh, it's a managed identity. It's different than an application. Okay, it's still a service principal, and that's tied to an application registration. But if I search that, it's not in my tenant. So where is it? We don't need to know that. We're users. It's a managed identity. Don't worry too much. Versus an application, which will be the service principal, or they'll call service principals enterprise applications. There's a lot of wording to look out for in that sense. But they'll also be resource specific permissions too sometimes. I know you mentioned with AWS, like
Yeah.
local users. So maybe you've got Kubernetes set up with like local users, local RBAC. You
Yeah.
can set it up with Azure, but you can set it up locally as well. And that'll create more situations where an exposed resource may not be as easy to control as you think it is by just using Entra ID, if not everything is using that as the identity store.
Because now we are in the territory of, I think we're talking about this from a user, devices, and workload identity perspective, like the three broad categories. But then where it gets a bit tricky, to your point, if we pull that back to native Kubernetes kind of resources, where now in this land of cloud native, there's like a data center within a data center. You think you have access, you don't really have access until you actually try looking into it. In terms of the way I see it, RBAC is usually people from an on-premise world, and putting that hat back on, we usually believe that, hey, you know what, Azure policy, I make sure that Ashish only has access to Exchange, he only has access to, I don't know, SharePoint, or perhaps even Azure Portal, for lack of better, and that's probably like the extent of it. Is there something for us to understand from a perspective of third party as well? For example, I may have a CSPM or CNAB. How do those kind of identities interact in Azure?
So there might be I think we might be talking about two contexts here. One would be the permissions that an application has in our environment.
Yep.
The other would be the permissions that it has through us. So application versus delegated permissions ends up being a big thing in the Azure space with applications.
Okay.
An application can have permissions within Azure. So app roles would be the API word for it,
Yeah.
as opposed to the friendly word that give it the ability to do something like read our whole directory or modify our users if it's maybe we have an identity management solution that we want to use along with Azure or Entra ID, I should say. And in that case, the identity itself will have the ability to perform tasks without a user. But then we'll have something else called application permissions. And this is where we start getting into the type of OAuth illicit consent grants you might see, or phishing. Somebody says, hi, I'm SharePoint, click this link,
Yep.
grant me access to see all your documents. And that's a little bit more the user has the ability to consent to an app and grant them the ability to perform certain actions on the user's behalf. So there needs to be that interactive component of a user saying, hey, yeah, you can do this as me. And then the app needs to perform an impersonation flow basically to say, hey, I've got this token from the user. I'd like to exchange it for a token to do things as the user. Can you give that to me? And
Yep.
once they get that, you can have the point of somebody reading your emails, modifying your files, things like that, to the point that they've introduced features now where in Entra ID, you can, as an administrator, set up certain high risk permissions
Mhm.
that a user can't consent to without you approving first. So that's different than me assigning permissions to the application as an admin, though. If I assign app permissions to the application,
Yep.
it can do things without any user in the mix. But if I require my approval, a user can create a request in Entra ID and say, hey, I'd like to grant super legit mail access to my calendars. Is that okay? And you can say, no, that's not approved. That sounds very shadowy to me.
Interesting, and I think there's a similar concept in AWS as well, because kind of they call it instance profile roles or instance roles or whatever. But I think I was thinking more from a perspective of, and because these are important, is there a third layer for example, I don't know, just think of any product, performance management product or cloud security product that has to talk to Azure to find out, hey, how many blob storages are exposed on the internet? Is that going to borrow my permission, or is that going to be a managed identity, or would that be a service principal? Because the reason I say that is because, at least in the AWS land or even GCP for sometimes as well, you have the lay of the land from a, hey, now that I know the kind of identity, I've got local Active Directory, and then I take a step back. Okay, now my workload itself can have an identity, which is what you were referring to as well with the app role, I think you called it. And so there is that as well. The other thing that we will also talk about is the third, quote unquote, third party. Like, for example, tomorrow, I don't know, some third party I've been using. Like, I'm just thinking about all these other products that we integrate into a cloud world, which may not be normal in an on-premise context. Like in an on-premise, I'm actually literally installing a software going next on a server. I know, oh, that's my Apache box. Every time I go to it, that's my web server. But in the context of cloud, there's a lot of third-party services that help a security person do security, whether it's your how many blob storages across my entire subscription tenant or whatever is. How do they interact and kind of work in the Azure world?
Yeah, so in that case, you'd need to understand the scope of the permissions. I've been
Yeah.
talking a lot about the Entra permissions. The app role would be usually things that are being assigned within Entra, but you can also have permissions assigned in the context of other applications that offer their own app roles you can assign. So permissions that I give an identity to perform in Microsoft Graph is usually how it works for Entra ID. Most of the access to the data and the data modification in Entra is through Microsoft Graph permissions. If it's in Azure, though, specifically Azure, talking about can I see all of the resources or all of the blobs associated with something, that can be a couple different ways. I don't know off the top of my head if there's app roles specific to Azure permissions, but what comes to top of mind is Azure RBAC. So
Okay.
something to know is that those service identities can still have the same role assignments that a human identity can have. So I might have global admin, a service principal could have global admin. Those are Entra permissions.
All
A
right.
service principal could also have something like reader. So reader would be an Azure RBAC permission that lets me see everything in the scope of it. So like the subscription, I can see all the resources now. I can
Yep.
also assign that to a service identity just like I can a human.
Yep.
They just get extra special app roles as well to make things complicated.
Yeah, I think I feel like there's a lot of Entra ID information that people need to learn to understand the lay of the land from an incident perspective. Because I think this has been already going in a good direction because I'm able to draw some parallels between something that I already know with AWS and on-premise, but also understand the complexity of there's a few more types of identity, more than just your Active Directory domain account. Or there's a global admin, there's service principal, the users as well, their app roles as well, their managed identities as well. In terms of, I guess the next component that I normally think about, and my hope is at least people who are listening or watching to this, they would be able to at least walk away drawing similar parallels between different parts of tech as we care about. We spoke about identity. The next obvious one that I come to mind is networking. In terms of how people have done networking in the on-premise world, as long as two servers are in the same network, they talk to each other. As long as the subnet is same and IP, the CIDR end or whatever is the same, they can talk to each other. Now, obviously, AWS and Google Cloud have their own way of doing networking on how that works. If I were to put that kind of same networking question on the Azure land, maybe first from what happens inside an Azure virtual network, and then extend that to the on-premise world. How is that usually, I guess, lay of the land from that perspective? If people are thinking about from an incident response perspective, what's some of the things people should understand about the Azure networking?
Yeah, I think so. It's important to understand, and from the classical networking sense, the infrastructure networking for Azure is going to feel pretty similar. There's going to be network service security groups. There we go, NSGs. I'm so used to the acronym, I forget the expansion. That's the Microsoft world for you. So you've got NSGs for handling network traffic, you've got your VNets, and you can set up routing between them separately. Things on the VNets can talk to each other. It's all pretty familiar.
Yep.
Something to keep in mind is that there'll still be the scenarios you're used to seeing on premises. There might be a load balancer for an application. There might be a separate firewall configuration or different types of networking groups that you need to pay attention to. They have like application security groups which do routing at more the application layer, and then network security groups, which do the network routing. There might be a WAF involved. And if you're used to the on-premises configuration of things, I remember when I started getting involved with cloud, I was so upset because I'd had the opportunity to work with some Palo Altos early in my career. And the concept that you could control everything going out of the company was beautiful, right? Every
Yep.
request had to come through us.
Yep.
We would try to support everyone to the best of our abilities, but we'd know. We could see the config. You could access that. And with Azure, because now all these little resources are they're like micro networking resources, and they're all split up around subscriptions and resource groups. So figuring out how they map together can be really complicated. There's also going to be resources that look nothing like what you're used to from on premises. Things like platform as a service, so Azure's database services, storage, things like that. They're going to have custom networking rules, so they don't really have the idea of a VNet.
Yep.
You can use a private endpoint to change how things route with it, but they're still going to pay attention to their own little networking rules that are going to be a subset of a special property of an object that you need to look for and know that is where the networking rules are kept for that type of resource. So you might want to spend some time looking into just storage and some time looking into just like the databases or a certain type of database, or just how networking is configured in AI services. If you're starting to use AI in Azure and you have a deployment, where is the networking for that object set? And how can you take a better look at that? So it's going to be this constant evolution. I think if anybody's been listening and they're thinking, oh my gosh, this person's just telling me so many things in so many directions about Azure, and I'm afraid, and this doesn't sound fun, I would encourage you to at least try a little bit, because learning little bit by bit in Azure is the way it's always going to work. There's still stuff that I get reminded by the experts, no, Katie, this thing does exist, or no, actually, this feature's been out longer than you thought. It's been a risk longer than you thought. This is, as a researcher, all I do is read Azure News right now. I'm telling you, I'm not quite crying about this every day, but all I do is learn about Azure day after day. There's always something more to know, but it doesn't make it a hopeless quest, right? If you can be that subject matter expert for your company, this stuff is really complicated. And if you can be the person who's, yeah, I know how to search the Azure portal, I'm not afraid to touch that specific web UI, because people get allergic to it. They're really terrified.
Yep.
If you're not afraid to interact with that specific portal, you're already a benefit to your company, I'm guessing, if it's anything like where I've been before. Nothing against any place I've been, just there's so many clouds, so many things to do, and somebody who's willing to really just start tinkering with cloud and looking into it will make so much of a difference to any environment.
I think the networking one is definitely one of those ones where it, to your point, when a lot of people move from on-premise to the cloud world, they may look at that and going, this does not make sense at all. Like to your point about the Palo's firewall, whether it's Checkpoint firewall, Palo Alto firewall, a lot of us have gone through our own versions of firewalls in our life, whatever we got access to first. And we definitely, I guess there's definitely a difference in terms of how things are done in cloud. Because I think you made a video on was it query that you could use for cloud security assessment?
Yeah, it's the resource graph
Resource graphs,
query
that's the one. I was trying to think of the
panel.
name for
Yeah.
it. Yeah. But so for Advent of Cloud Security, you did a resource graph on how that could be a great starting point to even start talking about what is the baseline for security in Azure. And we just touched on identity and networking as the two components that maybe you don't have to start there. Just start from the resource graph part. And maybe hopefully that kind of helps you identify, oh, okay, before I start building a whole incident response plan, let's just see what is wrong with my environment in the first place to begin with. Which kind of makes me also think, what are some of the common incidents in Azure that you probably have seen that maybe people can use as a starting point?
Yeah, so we talked a lot about exposure to the public internet. You'll probably see a lot of that if you're in an environment where you're positioned on the security team, either like the security engineering, I was going to say blue team or incident response, but they're both blue team. So
Yeah.
either if you're trying to design more secure infrastructure, or if you're investigating compromises, you'll probably see a lot of, hey, something's been hit with suspicious traffic. Microsoft might email you and say, we're going to turn this off if you don't stop your nonsense. And you're like, what nonsense? We're not, what? And then you look and it's nonsense. There might be some database exposures, especially understanding how your company's big applications work can be very helpful. or what experimental projects are going on. You might get alerts around crypto mining and maybe somebody's looking into it legitimately. So getting used to asking that context about different incidents is really helpful. I think the incidents are basically benign, or we don't talk about that due to the sensitivity of our employers. It can be a little tricky to find an in between. I will say that things that are really helpful to understand a bit more
Yeah.
would be those OAuth illicit consent grants. So it's very popular right now as an alternative to phishing. If I get somebody to click yes on my application, and they're adding more protections around this in Microsoft, where you need to be either a verified publisher, which isn't that hard, but it's at least a bar, or you can only request certain permissions, maybe based on your set organizational settings. Go understand what are those settings for your organization, get the permissions you need to see those settings for your organization and to see the resources. I think you mentioned the resource graph query as well. I love that panel so much. So everything you have reader over in an Azure environment, you can query using that. So it's different from Microsoft Graph, which is related to Entra ID. It's different than the Azure AD Graph, which is another
Wow.
different graph. This is the Resource Graph Explorer. There are certain words Microsoft loves. Graph is one of them. None of them are graph API, like the graph APIs.
Yeah.
It's a graph. Call it graph. And in this case, resource graph means a database of all of your resources that you can query like that database using KQL, Microsoft's query language. So there's a lot of guides on how to query it. I've got some example queries in the repository that I put up for Advent of Cloud. So I definitely recommend playing around with those. There's Terraform code to spin up some resources too. Super easy if you've never played with Terraform before, no previous experience required. And then you can see just how easy it is to say, okay, what public IPs do I have? What databases do I have? And how are they configured? Can they even access the public internet? How is that set up? And then a little bit more complex, you can chuck a big block of text Microsoft provides to map IPs back to VMs, which is really helpful because the public IP is a resource, the network interface is a resource, and the VM is a resource. We need to associate these resources together just to understand if the computer's on the internet. So it can be very helpful to get some baseline queries like that down as well.
And would you say, because we live in the world of AI these days, is there an AI specific one that comes to mind as well for any of these common incidents in Azure?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked that actually. I have not been able to look into this too much yet, but there's been a lot of what they call LLM jacking going around recently. So there were some really good reports that have come out in the last year. If you look up LLM jacking, you'll find them, where this is just basically another type of resource theft. If a resource exists and it's useful to people, somebody will want to steal that compute power from you. And in this case, if they have the token, so like your authentication token for a model, and access to that API model, the URL that it's living at, which will be where it was deployed to when you created the resource, how you interact with it, then an attacker can basically slap this into a large infrastructure they have that creates a backend pool of AI resources that they can send queries to. So maybe I want to offer a cool AI service to my friends for nothing. Maybe I want to generate content that other engines won't let me. I'm just going to take a bunch of other people's AI models and chuck those into the background of this. And then I'm going to load balance between all those resources. And they've got great logs for how this has been investigated in AWS.
Right.
Really interesting write up, scary write up, but really interesting write up. But then for the Azure side, there's code referencing that AI models hosted in Azure, I should say, can be used in this way. But I think there's been a little bit less done on the hunting front, and the logging for that service specifically can be a little bit tricky to set up and get the depth that you would need compared to AWS. So I would look out for it. If you got a notification related to it, I would look into it, certainly. But there's been a little bit less specific research, though I would say all signs point to it's happening.
Interesting. And maybe just on a similar note, then anything on the whole privilege escalation as well? You had a talk at Fort CloudSec as well about the whole privilege escalation. Any examples of privilege escalation that you could share as well?
Yeah, so I had a blog on privilege escalation. I had a talk on persistence.
Oh, yeah.
One day I hope to have a talk on privilege escalation, but we'll see how that goes. So the privilege escalation that I published on a couple months ago was around Key Vault. So going back to identities a little bit,
Yeah.
Key Vault can be configured to use Azure permissions, Azure RBAC permissions to allow a user to do things like view secrets, manage secrets, things like that. And there's a couple of roles The permission related to this role has been talked about quite a bit before, but the risk of the role wasn't very well documented. So if a user has the ability to modify key vaults, they have the ability to modify access policies on key vaults.
Oh,
What are
okay.
access policies? They're another alternative form of authentication, well, not, or authorization, I should say, authorization, where if you choose not to use Azure RBAC for your key vault, you can use one of the two. If you don't use it, your key vault will use access policies. And access policies are just saying this identity can read, write, edit, secrets, certificates, whatever. It's just a different model. But if you have a role that says you can't read Azure RBAC, or there's some particularly tricky wording like the Azure RBAC, I can't remember it, but it was basically saying that you have no RBAC secrets access to Key Vault, but you can have access policy secrets access if the Key Vault is using access policies. If it's configured that way, you can modify an access policy, put yourself on it, and access and modify all the secrets. So
Oh,
because of the way this is worded, it's not a vulnerability. It's two different conflicting models of permissions.
right.
One allows you to manage access policies, and if you don't use access policies, that's not a problem. It won't be helpful. But if you do use access policies, then you can use it to access secrets. So just being very careful on the wording, right? You can feel sometimes like you're in a lot of, you're just dug deep into the riddles sometimes was trying to figure this out. No RBAC secrets access. Does that mean no secrets access? What does that mean? How can
Okay.
we articulate what that means better? And there's now a nice big warning page. The box is about this big on that role, which I'm very happy that they put in place. I reached out to MSRC about this. The documentation was updated, and then I got a response that because the document said the risk, it wasn't an issue, which okay, all right, sure. It's on the page now. That's great. I like that.
We enter this episode for a special message from this episode's sponsor, Vanta. So you know the status of your compliance controls right now? Like right now? We know that real-time visibility is critical for security, but when it comes to our GRC programs, we rely on point-in-time checks. More than 9,000 companies have continuous visibility into their controls with Vanta. Vanta brings automation to evidence collection across over 350 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. They also centralize key workflow like policies, access reviews, and reporting, and help you get security questionnaires done 5 times faster with AI. Now, that's the new way to GRC. Get started with vanta.com/cloud. That's VANT.com/CLOUD cloud to get started. Now back to the episode. And what about the persistence that you were referring to as well? Maintaining.
Yeah, so the persistence was around administrative units, if we want to talk about that a bit. Yeah, administrative units were introduced to allow scope of Entra ID role assignment. So before, if I get help desk administrator, that's everybody. I can help desk everybody. You call me up, I'll reset your password. And they've changed the role, right? So I can't really reset privileged roles anymore. Or if I'm a user authentication administrator or user, there's basically, if I can manage user authentication, it's going to be everybody. So an administrative unit was introduced to finally allow scoping of that. Maybe I only need to manage users who are in Boston
Okay.
because I am just the Boston IT person. I
Yeah.
really don't need to reset everybody else in the company. So administrative units allow you to provide that scope. I put a bunch of users into that administrative unit, and then I say, okay, Katie can reset passwords for these people, but I can't reset passwords for anyone else. And then there's this opposite property of them called a restricted management administrative unit, which is newer, which kind of is the opposite logically. It takes a group of people, and unless someone has a role assignment over that group of people specifically, no one can manage them. So if I take CEO, C, and our favorite high profile blogger who might be subject to attacks, I put them in an administrative unit, and that's restricted. And now I give, we'll say, Bob the access to manage their accounts. Bob can manage their accounts, but he's the executive IT guy now. Nobody else can manage those accounts. So these are really great features. There might be ways attackers could use them in ways we're not looking for. Obviously, if I don't know what an administrative unit is, if I don't know that, and then an attacker puts a bunch of users in a restricted administrative unit to protect them, I'm going to get really confused when I can't reset their passwords. My scripts might fail for containment. I might not notice.
Yep.
I might not know how to investigate it. There's another property called hidden membership that wasn't super clearly documented, but basically, unless you had a very privileged role, you couldn't see the membership of an administrative unit. So I could create a situation, these scenarios need super high privileges, I should specify. I would need
Yeah.
to be global admin, privileged role admin as an attacker to perform them, but I could hide the scope of a role assignment I give to myself. Maybe I give myself the scoped role assignment over nothing to see here, the administrative unit, and then I put the CEO in there, who, if he's not in a restricted administrative unit already, and then nobody can really investigate that. Maybe our analysts don't have permissions to see into administrative units. And then to clean that up, you also have to go to someone with very high privileges, like a global admin.
Yep.
I don't know about you, it's really hard to get their time, I've found. So that can be pretty tricky as well. So I definitely recommend looking out for scoped role assignments related to that. And there's a couple other detections in the article that we put up around this.
I'll put the link at the show notes and the description as well for this. Because I think having this conversation is also making me think, like, now that we understand, okay, at least for people from a different background, they'll all understand the identity pieces, the networking pieces. Probably they have, or they would have heard of examples already of the kind of scenarios people can see as well. If you were to start building this and starting off from maybe just a simple playbook, usually a lot of people kind of talk about the whole, hey, this is also the land when people go into the land of E5 licenses, E7 licenses. I have this security, that security, and there's just-in-time access, and without adding all that complexity into this, there's just super simple scenario of if I wanted to just make a playbook. To your point, I saw a resource graph explorer and I saw a bunch of things. I'm like, what would be level 0, for lack of a better word, for a playbook that I can start establishing today? If I wanted to just play, to your point, I come from an AWS land or GCP land or from an on-premise land. I'm trying to just build my first playbook because my company has acquired another company that is Azure. I'm the cloud security person for Azure now.
Congrats, if so. Yeah, I would say, without taking into account, I'm glad you mentioned scheduled and just-in-time access. We didn't even get to touch on that, but that's a whole other can of worms. But I'd start making sure that you've got the access and the logs that you need, and that'll take you down some rabbit holes, honestly. So if you use Splunk, they have a guide for like tips and tricks on getting Microsoft data into Splunk. That was very helpful to me when I started looking into this. The logs, where they're stored and how to forward them, can be different for different services.
Okay.
You likely won't have logs yet on things like who accessed secrets in a key vault, who accessed or changed storage in a storage account. For those, you need diagnostic or resource logs. Those are going to be resource specific. They're going to be costly to implement. So start those battles now for your key resources, either key resource types or key projects, making sure that you've got all levels of your Azure resources, your Azure resource logs at the control plane level. So resources that were created and deleted, resource group and subscription type stuff. That's going to be different than getting your Entra ID or Azure AD logs forwarded. So making sure that you're tackling both of those and then looking into the diagnostic or resource logs. You're going to need to make sure your team has access as well. So getting people reader access on everything, if possible, is very helpful within Azure RBAC. But again, you're going to need a different permission within Entra ID as well to make sure that you can be a directory reader. You can use the Azure portal in some environments that's restricted, or the Entra ID portal is restricted. And as you do this, write out some guides for people, because you don't want to be the first. Maybe you're always going to be the first person who gets called for this, but the more you can train people, the better. Especially things around like writing down what GUID corresponds to what. There's going to be these long strings that represent object IDs, and which object ID relates to what part of an identity can be really complicated. If I'm a user, I'll usually be referred to by my user principal name, which is going to be like Katie at tenant.onmicrosoft.com. But if I'm using a service principal, that could have a different identifier for the service principal object, the application registrations ID, the application registrations object, something else I'm forgetting, and just getting all of that straight so that whoever is looking at this ticket first doesn't completely lose their mind over this can be quite helpful. Which logs go to what resources. I'll say there's been some really good publishing. I saw an article just today from Invictus IR on roles you might need. It's pretty high level, but it's a good place to start. They've got a log extraction tool as well. If you don't have logging set up already for M365 at least, which will get you your Entra ID logs too. Microsoft has some IR playbooks, and you should have all these links so we can share them.
I will definitely
I put them down, but I found out Microsoft has some IR playbooks you can follow as well that are a little bit more general, easing into somebody got phished with an OAuth app. Where do we go from there? And maybe you thought you were going to be the cloud resources responder. You were going to respond to virtual machines and LLM jacking and really interesting cloud stuff. And now you get called every time something happens in Microsoft 365 or SharePoint is exposed to the internet. It's a slippery slope. They've got some playbooks you can look at there that might be helpful.
It's an interesting one because I think that's where, because there's obviously a shift happening in the cloud security landscape where a lot of the cloud security, I want to say logging and alerting for security is being sent over directly to SOC teams, not being, there's no middle person who's a Azure cloud security expert or a AWS cloud security expert. It's going straight from your resource graph or Explorer all the way to your Splunk or Sleem or whatever other SIEM provider you have in front of a SOC operator who probably maybe has some idea about Azure, maybe not some Azure ideas. Are we saying that because this Azure portal thing is this new way of doing cloud, at least in the Microsoft land, does M365 SharePoint, is that obviously to your point, you need that because so you get the entire lay of the Microsoft landscape, or is that because how everything is connected in Azure? I guess where I'm going with this is that if I have just the logs for virtual machines, if I just have, I don't know, some kind of reader access, let's just say, would I still need to, or does it tend to happen that there are more issues usually on M365 compared to Azure, or where should I focus my energy on? Because I feel like there's a lot. Because once you go into that world of Microsoft, now only to your point earlier, there's tenants, there's subscription, depending on how many subscription, how many tenants, and then, oh, I'm looking after M365 and SharePoint and Azure AI Studio and something else comes. It feels like the pot keeps growing. What's a good baseline to start building this? Because I feel like a lot of people maybe feeling like what I am, like, oh shit, there's a lot to kind of start. What's a good level zero that I can start with in terms of resource?
Yeah, it is a ton. For me, I try to remind myself on the days that I feel like, oh my gosh, I've been at this years and I still feel like an idiot. If you feel like the spot you're in security is messy, you're probably in a really good spot because they must need a lot of security. I say that both in a charming but like a crying, laughing and crying way there, but there's always something new to learn. That said, do not pressure yourself to learn it all at once. For myself, I started out by learning just Azure fundamentals and seeing how our coverage and security of those were at the role that I was at previously.
Yep.
Talking to people about what does it take to secure this? When we're following up on these incidents, what lessons learned are we taking away? For me, it ended up being a little bit more cross-disciplinary because there weren't multiple Azure subject matter experts available, or if they were a little bit more like managing Azure, and that's okay. We get to know them, but in terms of securing it, there wasn't a set number of champions. And I think this is just the case with Azure right now. It'll probably change in the future.
Yep.
I've noticed with AWS, you might have 20 passionate folks at your beck and call to talk AWS and tell you when you're wrong and things like that. I'm going to be honest, when I joined in my current role, people really like AWS where I am, and both internal and external to the company. I had some people who said, so you joined as an Azure? Why would you do that? Yeah, I know my niche. So definitely start out understanding, how does networking work? What are the general types of identities? How do those interact? Great baseline for that is AZ-104. That's the Azure Administrator Associate. They have free labs online that Microsoft will let you spin up. You just click a button, it makes a lab, you do the thing it's telling you to do. You learn quite a lot by clicking through it, and then it'll destroy the lab for you. You don't have to pay a thing. You don't have to set up anything complicated. And that's really helpful because I think especially when you're starting out, it's like telling someone to just install virtualization and start setting up their own like custom Arch Linux VMs when they first get into security. No, we don't need to hurt ourselves that much unless we want to. So Microsoft Learn's resources are fantastic there. Even if you don't take the test, it's a great way to get familiar with the terms. If you ever need video guidance, John Saville on YouTube is like,
oh my god, yeah,
the greatest, right? I always feel so happy every time I watch his content.
Oh Jesus, that guy is so dedicated.
He's an inspiration. Yeah. And he doesn't know this, but he's always been there for me, right? Through his videos. If I need to understand something, he has a whole video on service principals and application registrations. That's just him being like, as the like video image, because that's how it feels. But he's there with you. It's okay.
I think he's probably the only person who talks that much about Azure. To your point about security, the champions for Azure, I think There are definitely people who talk about different certifications, but in terms of, I maybe because he comes up from that solution architect background and teaching background, but he definitely covers in-depth videos. I think there was a AI video I think I saw from him on Azure, like a 3 hour video. This guy, 3 hour lecture. I'm like,
Goes hard, yeah.
yeah, is there an AI to compile this and I can talk to it? Or somehow, I'm sure there'll be a version for that as well one day for John whenever he hears. We actually had him on the podcast a couple of years ago, funny enough. It was
Oh,
really interesting. And I definitely find it to be great that you actually called out. You don't have to jump into the deep end straight away. There's actually easier path to just start scratching the surface with just understanding the fundamentals, lay of the land as well. At least from what I've heard so far, there is definitely a foundation fundamental that is already maybe most people are aware of if they're coming from on-premise or from AWS landscape. It's just basically how does that work in this particular world of Azure? Out of curiosity, I don't know, it's one of those controversial questions as well. Can there be a multi-cloud person? I personally feel there can be. It's just you can be like jack of all trades, yes, but would you be that good in AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle, whatever else comes out tomorrow? And that's my personal opinion, but I'm just curious as to where do you stand on that?
I think you can be multi-cloud. I think you just need to, for me at least, I always have to remind myself that like all things in time. So my past role, I was technically doing a cloud incident response across all three clouds. It was a very big
Wow,
organization.
wow, okay.
It's just that we had the most adoption that we could help respond, or like business adoption for areas we were focused in at the time. We had a lot of that with Microsoft, which made
Right.
it an easy place to focus. And then people start pinging you for M365. And don't worry about that till you get there. But it just happened. I think you mentioned everybody knows about Active Directory.
Yep.
When I was a pen tester, I really wanted to be one of those cool Active Directory pen testers who knew everything. I learned a lot. Like I knew it was really rewarding to learn, and there's more Windows registry keys than stars in the sky. It's a rewarding practice, but there were a lot of people in that space, so I think it wasn't really as easy to go forge new paths, and you had to get really deep into the internals to start having an impact. I like that I get the Microsoft flavor in Azure. If you're used to the Microsoft flavor of everything's expanding and there's lots of strange and interesting things happening, you'll always get it with Azure. If you're more used to other clouds, you'll be able to relate it to other clouds and kind of wonder why on earth things happened a little bit differently and more strangely in that way. You can do multi-cloud at a surface level
Yeah,
for
okay.
all clouds, obviously,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
maybe to a medium level. I think especially if the demand of your role gives you that. Ultimately, you want to be able to line up what you're learning with what you're able give your company, not in a capitalist sense, but like you want to have impact, right? You
Yeah,
want to be
of
able to
course,
do
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So if there's a truly multi-cloud company, you can probably be a truly multi-cloud person really easy, right? Because you'll get an extra 40-ish hours a week to be a multi-cloud person.
And
But I
I
think the level of depth for each cloud, no, that's not without sleeping.
Yeah, I think that's where I feel, and I think, but the reason I wanted to cover this is because we had a lot of conversation around. A lot of people want to have conversation with Azure folks in their organization, or even Kubernetes folks for that matter as well. Some people just want to get to a point where they can actually have a conversation without feeling lost. It's I have no, I think from everything we have spoken about so far, I definitely feel I'm walking away from this conversation just going, oh, at least I know what some of the similarities between, say, an AWS type of incident versus an Azure type of incident would be. But I also understand the complexity that, oh, okay, networking may be slightly different, but at least I know I have to focus on the identity, the kind of access, and then build on my playbook. And obviously, there are some examples that you shared as well, which I'll put in the link as well. And that's most of the technical questions I had. I've got three more fun questions for you. Hopefully, I can get through them really quickly as well.
Cool, no rush.
Yeah. So first one, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on doing the research with Azure or doing security of Azure?
So is this outside of work or what do I
I
do
mean, you can do
inside of
whatever. You can outside of work
career?
or work related as
Out,
well.
yeah, outside of security research. So right now I've been with Datadog about 1 year. I'm working a lot on deepening my relationships with the product team
Yep.
to help influence our product. The reason I say this is that before my job was like all influence in politics because it was a very big organization. Now I get a very in-depth technical role, but those kinds of relationships with teams where you know the Azure person to call or somebody who says, yeah, I can help you out with that, or people who are looking for each other. It takes a really long time to meet all those people and convince them that they should talk to you on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So I'm working on that, and also not just security says as an influence, but how can we like work with people to give them the answers that they actually want from me. So that's a big focus inside, along with the research, the speaking, the posting, stuff like that, and finding vulns, which is great. Love that. Really love that. Outside of work, I started taking guitar lessons because research is a lonely life. This is the two sides is that if you work in a big company, you're never going to feel like I've found you're never going to feel like you get the technical depth you crave because you need to do so many things across so many surfaces as a business.
Yeah.
But you'll have so many friends to go through it with. You'll be in the trenches with so many people. If you get to talk to somebody, say, hey, how's it going? They're like, oh, going through it. Remember that incident from last quarter? And you'll be like, oh, I'm crying with you, buddy. With research, I have time to focus on Azure and learn Azure. I love that. I love my deep friendship with the cloud, but I might go days where I'm not really talking very much. And so getting some music in my life has been very helpful for that. Some expression, something to do that's not screen oriented. So that's been my out of work focus right now, though we'll see how many weeks it takes me to get to Wonderwall. I'll
Oh,
have to keep you
fair.
posted on that.
I guess for people who will watch this on YouTube or LinkedIn, they can see the guitar hanging at the background as well. So you can definitely
Yeah,
know.
that one's a ukulele. That one's a
Oh,
tiny
is that a
guitar.
ukulele? Oh,
Yeah, yeah, I also enjoy noodling around with that. It's much less intimidating. I highly recommend it. It's got 4 strings. It's about yay big. So
oh, okay, there you go. I mean, it looks pretty big from this angle, I guess, because they're quite far. I'm like, oh, that's
maybe
pretty
it's
big.
a little bit,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's not that bad.
The second question that I have for you is, what is something that you're proud of that is not on your social media?
I don't know. There's so many things. Life's been pretty good, honestly. This is not like it sounds weird to say this is a pride thing, but I got married last year. I
Congratulations.
absolutely am so excited and happy about that. It's not easy so we had a lot of long distance going on, and then we had COVID. We were able to finally resolve that, spend some time together and tie the knot, and that's been a wonderful journey. So I don't know, that's like a pride thing,
I
but
think definitely a
I'm
proud
really
thing, and
happy about it.
congratulations
Yeah.
as well.
Thank you.
And maybe talking about things that you get to enjoy together, what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share with us?
Oh my gosh. There's two go-tos in the Toronto area. It's always going to be Thai or Indian.
Oh, nice.
If anyone's in Toronto, I highly doubt you will be, but the Thai restaurant is Chiang Mai. The Indian restaurant is Kathir. They're both great. I recommend both of them.
All right. At least I'm pretty sure people are. I should probably make a run of an AI agent that just goes through all the episodes, finds out all the food places that are recommended, and just puts them on a map somewhere. If any listener or watching person comes up with the AI agent to do this, please do that. All the episodes are public. But Thai and Indian sounds like a great idea as well.
If
And
you can
where
map
can
that onto
people find you
conference
on the internet, right?
locations. Oh, sorry, I said if you can map that onto conference locations, you'll have a
Oh,
bestseller.
actually, yeah, that could be something even more. I thought of writing like a Medium blog, but then I was like, I don't know what Medium blogs is, who reads it. But then if it's a map, if it's interactive, just talk to it, chat GPT. Hey, I'm going to be in San Francisco for RSA. What are some of the food places I can try? I love that. Maybe it could be something. If anyone listening or watching wants to make this for us, it'll be amazing. Thank you. Thank you in advance. Where can people get to know more about your Azure research and get to connect with you as well, Katie?
Yeah, so I don't post much outside of sharing things, but if I'm sharing things on LinkedIn, my name is Katie Knowles. On Twitter and Blue Sky, I have handles as well that are some variant of Sigil, but I can provide you those links. People can follow those if they'd like to see more. I'm mostly just retweeting Microsoft things or cool research my colleagues have done or things that I've finally gotten to publish.
That's awesome. And I'll put those links in the show notes as well. But thank you so much for coming on the show and introducing us to the incident response world of Azure as well. I feel like there's a part two coming because I need to go deeper into some of these incidents. Maybe on one of those practical workshop things. We'll get to that as well one day.
Here's hoping.
Awesome. I'll keep that open. Thank you so much for Katie for this. And I'll talk to you soon. And I'll talk to everyone else as well. Peace.
Sounds great. See ya.
Thank you so much for listening and watching this episode of Cloud Security Podcast. If you've been enjoying content like this, you can find more episodes like these on www.cloudsecuritypodcast.tv. We are also publishing these episodes on social media as well, so you can definitely find these episodes there. Oh, by the way, just in case there was interest in learning about AI cybersecurity, we also have a sister podcast called AI Cybersecurity Podcast, which may be of interest as well. I'll leave the links in the description for you to check them out. And also for our weekly newsletter, where we do in-depth analysis of different topics within cloud security, ranging from identity, endpoint, defined all the way up to what is the CNAP or whatever a new acronym that comes out tomorrow. Thank you so much for supporting, listening, and watching. I'll see you next time.